A letter arrived 3 days after the funeral. Daniel opened it in his pristine office, hands trembling as words unraveled 30 years of silence. Frank Ramirez, the janitor who worked night shifts for 3 decades, was not a stranger. He was the father who had paid for everything, every textbook, every tuition check, every quiet sacrifice. The man who gave him up had never let him go. Daniel stood frozen, grief flooding through him like ice water, realizing he had been loved his entire life by someone he never knew existed. Now, there was only a grave to thank, only earth to answer his whispered confession. Subscribe to witness how invisible love can shape a destiny. Daniel Cruz sat in his office on the 14th floor of Austin General Hospital, the city sprawling beneath him like a circuit board of amber lights and restless motion. His desk was organized with surgical precision, every pen aligned, every file labeled, the kind of order that came from years of discipline and the belief that control could keep chaos at bay. He had just finished a 12-hour shift, his scrubs still faintly smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion, and his mind was already cataloguing the next day's procedures when his assistant knocked softly and handed him a cream-colored envelope. The return address belonged to a law firm he had never heard of, and the paper felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried more than ink and formality. He opened it without ceremony, expecting some bureaucratic matter, a misfiled document or a clerical error, but the first sentence stopped his breath cold and turned his world into something unrecognizable. The letter explained that Frank Ramirez had passed away 3 days prior, alone in a small apartment on the east side of the city, and that Daniel Cruz was listed as the sole beneficiary of his modest estate. Daniel read the name twice, searching his memory for some connection, some forgotten encounter, but Frank Ramirez meant nothing to him. He had never met the man, never heard the name spoken in his adoptive parents' home, never seen his face in a photograph or a crowded room. The lawyer's words continued with clinical efficiency, detailing bank accounts and personal effects, but then came the paragraph that shattered everything Daniel thought he knew about his life. Frank Ramirez was his biological father, the letter stated, and for the past 30 years he had anonymously funded Daniel's entire education, from kindergarten through medical school, working night shifts as a janitor to ensure his son would never want for opportunity or knowledge. Daniel's hands began to shake, the paper trembling like a leaf caught in wind, and he had to set it down on his desk to keep from crumpling it into something formless and irretrievable. The office around him felt suddenly foreign. The framed diplomas on the wall, the awards and certifications, all of it now recontextualized by a truth he had never suspected. Every tuition payment, every scholarship notification, every moment of financial security that had allowed him to focus solely on his studies, all of it had been orchestrated by a man who lived in the shadows of his life, a ghost who had loved him from a distance so vast it might as well have been another dimension. Daniel thought of his adoptive parents, kind and supportive people who had raised him with warmth and encouragement, and he realized they must have known, must have been part of this silent conspiracy of care, allowing Frank to remain invisible while his money paved the way for Daniel's future. The grief came slowly at first, like water seeping through a crack, then all at once, a deluge that left him gasping and hollow. He had spent 28 years believing he was the architect of his own success, that his achievements were the result of his own discipline and intelligence, but now he understood that every step had been underwritten by a man who scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans while the world slept. Frank Ramirez had given him up for adoption, the letter explained, because he could not provide the stability a child deserved, but he had never stopped caring, never stopped working, never stopped sacrificing. Daniel tried to imagine the man, tried to construct a face and a voice from the sparse details in the letter, but all he could see was a figure bent over a mop, shoulders curved by exhaustion, eyes fixed on a future he would never be allowed to witness. He left the office without telling anyone where he was going, the letter folded in his coat pocket, its weight pressing against his ribs like a second heart. The elevator descended in silence, carrying him down through floors of sterile light and beeping machines. And when he stepped outside into the cool November evening, the city felt different, as though every building and street corner now held the memory of a man he had never met. Daniel walked without direction, his mind spinning through decades of phantom presence, every anonymous check, every silent prayer, every night spent in fluorescent-lit hallways, while Daniel slept in a warm bed and dreamed of becoming someone important. The irony cut through him like a scalpel. He had become a doctor, a healer, a man who saved lives, but he had never known the man who had saved his. When he finally stopped walking, he found himself standing in front of a small cemetery on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where headstones leaned at odd angles and the grass grew wild around forgotten names. The lawyer's letter had included the plot number, a grid reference that felt too impersonal for what it represented, and Daniel moved through the rows with a strange sense of inevitability, as though he'd been walking toward this moment his entire life without knowing it. He found the grave in a quiet corner, the earth still fresh and dark, a simple stone marker bearing only a name and 2 dates that bracketed 62 years of invisible devotion. Daniel stood there as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and dying gold. And he realized that grief was not just the absence of a person, but the presence of all the conversations that would never happen, all the gratitude that would never be spoken, all the love that would remain forever one-sided and unanswered. Daniel did not sleep that night, his mind circling endlessly around the revelation that had rewritten his entire history in a single afternoon. He lay in his apartment, a modern space with clean lines and expensive furniture, and felt the weight of every object around him, the leather sofa he had bought after his residency, the espresso machine on the granite counter, the medical journals stacked neatly on the coffee table, all of it suddenly stained with the knowledge that none of it would exist without Frank Ramirez. He stared at the ceiling, tracing the shadows cast by streetlights filtering through his blinds, and tried to calculate the cost of his education in hours of labor, in mop buckets filled and emptied, in floors scrubbed until they gleamed under fluorescent lights that no one else would ever notice. The numbers made him sick, the sheer magnitude of sacrifice condensed into decades of nocturnal anonymity, and he understood that Frank had spent more time thinking about Daniel than Daniel had ever spent thinking about himself. The next morning, he called the law firm and spoke to the attorney handling Frank's estate, a woman with a kind voice who seemed unsurprised by his shock and grief. She explained that Frank had been meticulous in his planning, setting up a trust fund when Daniel was still an infant, routing the payments through anonymous channels so that Daniel's adoptive parents could receive the money without revealing its source. Frank had attended Daniel's high school graduation, she said, standing at the back of the auditorium in his work uniform, and he had been outside the medical school on the day Daniel received his diploma, watching from across the street as cameras flashed and families celebrated. Daniel listened in stunned silence, his chest tightening with every new detail, every fragment of a life lived in parallel to his own, close enough to touch, but never touching. A father who had loved him with the devotion of a martyr and the discretion of a spy. He asked if there were any personal effects, anything that might help him understand who Frank had been beyond the role of silent benefactor, and the lawyer told him there was a small storage unit on the south side of the city. Daniel drove there that afternoon, navigating through neighborhoods he had never visited, streets lined with chain-link fences, and buildings that wore their age like scars. The storage facility was a grid of corrugated metal units, each one locked and anonymous, and when Daniel opened the one assigned to Frank, he found a space so small and sparse it made his throat close with emotion. There were a few boxes of photographs, all of them taken from a distance. Daniel at soccer games, at school plays, walking to his car after his first day of residency. There was a folder filled with newspaper clippings, articles about academic awards Daniel had won, interviews he had given, every mention of his name carefully cut out and preserved like relics of a saint. Daniel sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit, surrounded by the evidence of a love so vast and so invisible it defied comprehension, and he wept for the first time since childhood. The tears came hard and unrelenting, carving channels through the careful composure he had spent years constructing, and he realized that grief was not just sadness, but a kind of rage at the injustice of it all. Frank had deserved to hear Daniel say thank you, deserved to see him succeed, not from across a street, but from the front row, deserved to know that his sacrifice had not been abstract or theoretical, but real and transformative. Instead, Frank had lived and died in secrecy, his love a silent engine that powered Daniel's life while remaining forever unnamed and unacknowledged. And now there was no way to repay him, no way to close the distance that had always existed between them. Among the boxes, Daniel found a single letter, sealed and addressed to him in shaky handwriting, the ink smudged in places as though Frank's hands had trembled while writing. Daniel opened it carefully, his fingers clumsy with anticipation and dread, and read the words of a man who had known his death was approaching and wanted to leave something behind. The letter was short, only a few paragraphs, but every sentence carried the weight of 3 decades of unspoken devotion. Frank explained that he had given Daniel up because he was young and broke and terrified, because he wanted his son to have a better life than he could provide. But he had never stopped loving him, never stopped working, never stopped watching from the edges of Daniel's life. He wrote that he was proud of the man Daniel had become, proud of every achievement and every kindness, and that the greatest joy of his life had been knowing that Daniel was happy and safe and free from the struggles Frank had endured. The letter ended with a single sentence that Daniel would carry with him for the rest of his life. "You were never a stranger to me, even if I was always a stranger to you." Daniel folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, then sat in the silence of the storage unit, surrounded by the ghosts of a love he had never known existed. Outside, the city continued its indifferent sprawl, traffic humming, voices calling, lives intersecting and diverging in patterns too complex to map. But inside that small metal space, Daniel felt the presence of his father for the first time, not as a person, but as a force. A devotion so pure and so selfless, it reshaped everything he thought he understood about love and family and the quiet heroism of ordinary lives. Daniel returned to the cemetery the following evening, carrying with him the letter and a small bouquet of flowers he had bought from a vendor on the corner. The sky was overcast, heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never delivered, and the air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. He stood at Frank's grave and tried to find words, but language felt inadequate, a blunt instrument incapable of expressing the complexity of what he felt. Gratitude, grief, guilt, love, all of it tangled together into something wordless and overwhelming. He knelt in the grass, the dampness soaking through the knees of his jeans, and placed the flowers against the headstone, their bright petals a small rebellion against the grey monotone of the world around him. He thought about the nights Frank had spent working, imagined him pushing a mop down endless hallways, emptying trash cans in office buildings where no one knew his name, clocking out at dawn and returning to a tiny apartment with nothing but the knowledge that his son was sleeping safely somewhere across the city. The lawyer had provided Daniel with the address of Frank's apartment, and after leaving the cemetery, he drove there, parking in front of a squat brick building with peeling paint and bars on the windows. The neighborhood was quiet. the kind of place people passed through but never lingered in, and Daniel felt a strange vertigo as he climbed the stairs to the second floor, as though he were stepping into a life that had existed parallel to his own, but in a different key, a different register. The apartment was small, barely larger than a hotel room, with a single window that looked out onto an alley and a kitchenette that consisted of a hot plate and a dorm-sized refrigerator. The furniture was sparse and functional, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a folding table, a plastic chair, and Daniel realized that Frank had lived with almost nothing, stripping his life down to essentials so that every spare dollar could be funneled toward Daniel's future. On the wall above the bed, there was a single photograph, yellowed and curling at the edges, showing Frank as a young man holding an infant wrapped in a blue blanket. Daniel stared at the image, tracing the contours of Frank's face, the youthful hope in his eyes, the way his hands cradled the baby with a tenderness that contradicted the harshness of the room around him. This was the only memento Frank had kept from that brief period when he and Daniel had existed in the same physical space. And Daniel understood that this photograph had been Frank's talisman, the thing he looked at every morning before work and every night before sleep, a reminder of why he endured the exhaustion and the invisibility. Daniel took the photograph down carefully, holding it in both hands as though it were made of something fragile and irreplaceable, and felt the unbearable weight of all the years Frank had lived in this room, alone and uncelebrated, his entire existence oriented around a son who did not know he existed. In the narrow closet, Daniel found Frank's work uniforms, 3 identical sets of navy blue shirts and pants, each one washed so many times the fabric had gone soft and thin. There were also a few personal items, a cheap wristwatch, a pair of reading glasses, a paperback novel with a broken spine, and Daniel handled each object with the reverence of an archaeologist, unearthing artifacts from a lost civilization. He sat on the edge of the bed, the springs creaking beneath his weight, and tried to reconstruct Frank's life from these fragments, tried to imagine the rhythm of his days, the quiet routines that had sustained him through decades of solitude. Daniel thought about his own apartment, with its sleek appliances and comfortable furniture, and realized that the distance between the two spaces was not just economic but moral, a gap carved out by Frank's decision to live with less so that Daniel could have more. The rain finally came, as Daniel sat in the apartment, a steady patter against the window that turned the alley outside into a blur of grey and shadow. He thought about the nights Frank had walked home through rain like this, soaked and exhausted, returning to this tiny room with nothing but the knowledge that somewhere in the city, his son was dry and warm and working toward a future that Frank would never be part of. The injustice of it crushed Daniel, the sheer unfairness of a world that allowed someone to love so deeply and receive so little in return, and he understood that this was the true anatomy of sacrifice, not the grand gestures or the public proclamations, but the quiet daily erosion of the self in service of another, the slow dissolution of one life so that another could crystallize into something bright and whole. Before leaving, Daniel took one last look around the apartment, committing every detail to memory: the cracked linoleum, the water-stained ceiling, the narrow bed where Frank had slept and dreamed and died. He locked the door behind him and descended the stairs, the photograph tucked carefully into his jacket, and as he walked back to his car through the rain, he felt the presence of his father beside him, not as a ghost, but as a legacy, a quiet voice that would accompany him through every decision and every moment for the rest of his life. The rain soaked through his clothes, cold and insistent, but he did not hurry, allowing the weather to mark him, to leave its trace, as though by suffering this small discomfort he could somehow honor the much larger sufferings Frank had endured without complaint or recognition. Daniel began to investigate the financial trail Frank had left behind, not out of suspicion, but out of a desperate need to understand the mechanics of the sacrifice. to trace the lines of connection that had invisibly bound them together for 30 years. He met with the lawyer again, requesting copies of every document, every bank statement, every receipt, and she provided them in a thick manila folder that felt like a codex of secret history. Sitting at his kitchen table, Daniel spread the papers out in chronological order, creating a timeline that stretched from his infancy to his graduation from medical school. And he saw the pattern of Frank's life rendered in numbers and dates, a mathematical proof of love that required no words or explanations. Every month, like clockwork, Frank had deposited money into the trust fund, amounts that varied depending on how many shifts he had worked, but never missing a payment, never faltering even when illness or injury must have made the work unbearable. The amounts were modest, sometimes painfully small, and Daniel calculated that Frank had lived on a fraction of what he earned, surviving on rice and beans, on thrift store clothes, on a kind of austerity that bordered on asceticism. The trust fund had grown slowly over the years, compounding interest adding inches to the financial foundation that would eventually support Daniel's education. And Daniel realized that Frank had understood the power of time, had known that patience and consistency could transform pennies into dollars and dollars into degrees. The tuition payments to Daniel's private schools and universities had been made through an intermediary, an accountant who handled the logistics so that Frank's identity remained concealed, and Daniel imagined the precision required to maintain this fiction, the careful choreography that allowed Frank to be both present and absent, both father and stranger. Daniel discovered that Frank had worked for the same janitorial company for 30 years, moving between office buildings and schools, his employment record a monotonous scroll of night shifts and overtime hours. He had never taken a vacation, never called in sick unless absolutely necessary, and his supervisors had written brief, unremarkable evaluations that praised his reliability but never hinted at the extraordinary purpose that motivated him. Daniel tracked down Frank's former supervisor, a gruff man named Martinez, who managed a cleaning crew for a downtown office complex, and asked him what he remembered about Frank Ramirez. Martinez thought for a moment, then said that Frank had been quiet and dependable, the kind of worker you could forget about because he always showed up and always finished the job, but there had been something in his eyes, a kind of distant focus, as though he were thinking about something far beyond the floors he was mopping and the trash cans he was emptying. Daniel asked if Frank had ever mentioned a son, and Martinez shook his head, saying that Frank had been intensely private, never sharing details about his personal life, never joining the other workers for drinks or conversation. He had been a ghost even among his colleagues, Martinez explained, a man who moved through the world without leaving impressions, and the only thing Martinez remembered with any clarity was the way Frank would sometimes pause during his shift and stare out the windows of the buildings he cleaned, looking toward the part of the city where the university was located, as though he could see through walls and distance to the place where his son was studying. Martinez said he had always wondered what Frank was looking at, what private grief or hope kept him standing there in the dark, and now, hearing the story, he understood that Frank had been watching over Daniel in the only way he could, from afar, through glass and across miles, a silent guardian whose vigil never ended. Daniel thanked Martinez and left, driving through the city as night fell and the buildings lit up like constellations against the darkening sky. He thought about all the nights Frank had worked in these buildings, cleaning offices where executives made decisions and lawyers drafted contracts, invisible labor that kept the machinery of commerce running but received no recognition or gratitude. Frank had been one of thousands, maybe millions, of people who worked while others slept, whose contributions were essential but unnamed, and Daniel realized that his father's life was a rebuke to the way the world measured value, to the systems that rewarded visibility and ignored the quiet heroism of those who labored in the margins. Frank had been rich in the only currency that mattered, the currency of love and sacrifice, and he had spent it all on a son who did not know his name, investing everything in a future he would never share. When Daniel returned home that night, he took out the photograph he had found in Frank's apartment and placed it on his mantel, beside the framed diplomas and awards that marked his professional achievements. The juxtaposition felt right. A correction to the narrative he had believed about himself, an acknowledgement that his success was not his alone, but the product of a collaboration he had never known existed. He stood in his living room, looking at the photograph, at the young man holding the infant with such tenderness, and felt the distance between them collapse, felt the years of separation dissolve into something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite understanding, but something else. Something closer to recognition, the slow, dawning awareness that love could exist without proximity, that devotion could survive silence, and that the invisible architecture of sacrifice was the foundation upon which all his accomplishments had been built. Daniel found himself unable to return to his normal routines. The hospital shifts and the carefully ordered life he had constructed now feeling hollow and performative. Every time he put on his white coat, every time he held a stethoscope or reviewed a patient's chart, he was aware of Frank's presence in the margins of these actions, the unseen labor that had made them possible. He began to withdraw from social obligations, declining invitations from colleagues, ignoring calls from friends, retreating into a solitude that mirrored the one Frank had inhabited for most of his life. His adoptive parents called, concerned by his silence, and when he finally answered, he asked them the questions he had been too stunned to ask before. How long had they known? How much had they been told? Why had they agreed to keep the secret? His mother answered first, her voice shaking with emotion, explaining that Frank had contacted them when Daniel was still an infant, offering to fund the adoption and provide financial support as long as they promised never to reveal his identity. She said they had agonized over the decision, worried that keeping such a secret would harm Daniel in ways they could not predict, but Frank had been so earnest, so desperate to help without interfering, that they had eventually agreed. She described meeting Frank once in a park on a grey afternoon, and she said he had looked at Daniel with a kind of reverence that made her chest ache, the way someone might look at a holy relic or a work of art, something precious and unreachable. Frank had held Daniel for exactly 5 minutes, his mother said, cradling him with trembling hands, whispering words she could not hear, and then he had handed the baby back and walked away, disappearing into the city like smoke dissolving into air. Daniel listened in silence, his throat tight, understanding now that his entire childhood had been underwritten by a conspiracy of care, that every birthday gift and every family vacation had been made possible by Frank's anonymous contributions. His father, his adoptive father, spoke next, his voice low and measured, explaining that they had wanted to tell Daniel the truth when he was older, but Frank had made them promise to wait until after his death, believing that the knowledge would only burden Daniel and distract him from his studies. Frank had visited them occasionally over the years, his father said, always at night, always briefly, asking for updates and photographs, sitting at their kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a sad smile, never staying long enough to become familiar, but always leaving with a sense of peace, as though the brief glimpses of Daniel's life were enough to sustain him through the long stretches of solitude. Daniel thanked them and ended the call, then sat in the dark of his apartment, processing the revelation that his family had been built on a foundation of secrecy and sacrifice, that the life he had thought was simple and straightforward had actually been the product of complex negotiations and invisible generosity. He felt betrayed and grateful in equal measure, angry that the truth had been kept from him, but also aware that Frank had orchestrated this silence out of love, out of a belief that Daniel deserved to grow up without the burden of obligation or guilt. The logic was brutal but undeniable. Frank had erased himself from Daniel's life so that Daniel could be free, so that he could pursue his dreams without the shadow of a struggling father hovering over him. And the cost of that freedom had been Frank's complete and total invisibility. The following week, Daniel took a leave of absence from the hospital, citing personal reasons, and his colleagues expressed concern but did not press for details. He spent his days researching Frank's life, visiting the places where he had worked, talking to people who had known him in passing but never intimately. A security guard at one of the office buildings remembered Frank as a man who arrived early and left late, who never complained and never made mistakes, and the guard said there had been something ghostly about him. The way he moved through the halls without making noise, as though he were trying not to disturb the world around him. A cashier at the convenience store Frank had frequented recognized his photograph and said he had always bought the same things: cheap coffee, instant noodles, white bread, and he had always paid in exact change, counting out coins with the care of someone for whom every cent mattered. Daniel collected these fragments like pieces of a shattered mirror, trying to reassemble them into a coherent image of his father. But the picture remained incomplete, distorted by absence and the limits of memory. He realized that Frank had been a man who existed primarily in the space between visibility and invisibility, someone who had chosen to live on the periphery of society, and this choice had been both a strategy and a sacrifice, a way of ensuring that Daniel could occupy the center, the bright and celebrated space that Frank had vacated so his son could fill it. The weight of this realization was almost unbearable, the understanding that his life had been purchased with the currency of another's erasure, and Daniel found himself unable to sleep, haunted by visions of Frank walking home through empty streets, returning to his tiny apartment with nothing but the knowledge that somewhere in the city his son was safe and thriving, and completely unaware of the price being paid on his behalf. Daniel decided to honor Frank in the only way he knew how, by learning to see the world through his father's eyes, by understanding the contours of the life Frank had lived. He took a job at the janitorial company where Frank had worked, telling the supervisor he wanted to experience the work firsthand, and though the man looked at him with confusion and skepticism, he eventually agreed, assigning Daniel to the night shift at a downtown office building. Daniel arrived at 10 in the evening, dressed in the same navy blue uniform Frank had worn, and he felt the weight of the fabric against his skin, the way it smelled faintly of industrial detergent and old sweat. And he understood that this uniform was a kind of invisibility cloak, a garment that rendered the wearer unseen and unremarkable. The work was grueling in ways Daniel had not anticipated, not because of the physical labor, though his back and shoulders ached after the first hour, but because of the profound loneliness of it, the way the building felt like a tomb after the daytime workers had left, the silence broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of traffic. He mopped floors that gleamed under the artificial light, emptied trash cans filled with the detritus of corporate life, crumpled papers, half-eaten lunches, coffee cups with lipstick stains, and he thought about Frank doing this same work for 30 years, every night a repetition of the one before, every task completed with the knowledge that no one would notice or care. Daniel paused at the windows on the upper floors, looking out at the city as Frank must have done, and he saw the university in the distance, its buildings lit up like beacons, and he understood what Frank had been thinking during those pauses, the way his mind had traveled across the space between the janitorial closet and the lecture halls where Daniel was learning to save lives. By the end of the shift, Daniel was exhausted in a way he had never experienced in the hospital, a bone-deep weariness that came not from intellectual effort but from the repetitive, unrewarded nature of the work. He clocked out at 6 in the morning, the sky just beginning to lighten, and he walked home through streets that were slowly waking up, delivery trucks rumbling past, early commuters shuffling toward bus stops, and he felt a kinship with these people. The ones who worked while others slept, who kept the infrastructure of the city running without recognition or applause. He returned to Frank's apartment, which he had not yet given up, and he lay on the narrow bed where his father had slept, and he tried to imagine what it had been like to wake up here every afternoon, to eat a simple meal, to prepare for another night of invisible labor, and he felt the crushing monotony of it. The way each day bled into the next, without variation or hope of change. Daniel continued working the night shift for 2 weeks, and during that time, he spoke to other janitors, men and women who shared Frank's occupation and understood the peculiar isolation of the work. They told him stories of their own struggles, of bills that never stopped coming, of families they supported on wages that barely covered rent and groceries, and Daniel realized that Frank's sacrifice was not unique, but part of a larger pattern. A vast network of unseen labor that made modern life possible but received almost no acknowledgement. These people were the foundation of the city, he understood, the ones who cleaned the offices and hospitals and schools, who ensured that the visible world remained functional and presentable, and yet they moved through life like ghosts, their contributions essential but invisible, their names unknown to the people who benefited from their work. One night, Daniel was cleaning a conference room on the 15th floor when he found a photograph taped to the underside of a desk. A picture of a young girl smiling at the camera, her front teeth missing, her hair in pigtails. He realized that someone else had done what Frank had done, had found a way to carry their love with them into the workplace, to keep a reminder of why they endured the exhaustion and the loneliness. Daniel carefully replaced the photograph, understanding that this small act of concealment was also an act of devotion, a way of keeping the people you loved close, even when they were far away. And he thought about the photograph Frank had kept on his wall, the image of himself holding an infant Daniel, and he understood that these hidden talismans were the currency of invisible love, the way people survived when the world refused to see them. At the end of his 2 weeks, Daniel thanked the supervisor and returned the uniform, and though the man seemed puzzled by the entire experience, he shook Daniel's hand and said he had done good work. Daniel left the building as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the pavement, and he felt a profound exhaustion, but also a kind of clarity, a deeper understanding of the life Frank had lived and the choices he had made. He returned to the cemetery that afternoon, carrying with him the letter Frank had written and the photograph from the apartment, and he knelt at the grave, speaking aloud for the first time, telling his father about the work he had done, the people he had met, the way he now understood the weight of the sacrifice. He said he wished he could have known Frank, wished he could have shared even a single conversation, but he also understood why Frank had chosen silence, why he had remained a stranger, and he promised that he would carry this knowledge with him, that he would never forget the invisible architecture of love that had made his life possible. Months passed, and Daniel returned to his work at the hospital, but he was changed in ways that his colleagues could not fully understand. He approached his patients with a new kind of attention, listening not just to their symptoms, but to the stories beneath the symptoms, the hidden struggles and quiet sacrifices that shaped their lives. He began volunteering at free clinics in the neighborhoods where people like Frank had lived, offering his time and expertise to those who could not afford the kind of care he had been trained to provide. His colleagues remarked on the shift, noting that he had become more empathetic, more patient, less concerned with status, and more focused on service, and though they did not know the source of this transformation, they recognized its sincerity and depth. Daniel also began speaking publicly about his father, sharing Frank's story at medical conferences and community events, using his platform to highlight the invisible labor that sustained society. He talked about the janitors and the cleaners, the delivery drivers and the night shift workers, and he argued that their contributions deserved recognition and respect, that a society that ignored the people who kept it running was morally bankrupt. His speeches were passionate and personal, rooted in the specific details of Frank's life, but expanding outward to encompass the millions of others who lived in similar obscurity. And he found that audiences responded with emotion and recognition, many of them sharing their own stories of sacrifice and invisibility, their own experiences of being overlooked and undervalued. The story of Frank and Daniel spread through social media and news outlets, becoming a kind of parable about love and sacrifice, and Daniel received letters from people all over the country, thanking him for giving voice to experiences they had never been able to articulate. Parents wrote to him about the sacrifices they made for their children. Children wrote about the parents they had taken for granted. Workers wrote about the exhaustion and the loneliness of jobs that society dismissed as menial or unimportant. Daniel read every letter, responding personally when he could, and he felt a sense of connection to these strangers, a recognition that Frank's story was not just his own, but part of a larger tapestry of human devotion and struggle. He also used Frank's modest inheritance, the money left in the bank account after 30 years of frugal living, to establish a scholarship fund for the children of working-class families, specifically targeting those whose parents worked night shifts or multiple jobs to make ends meet. Daniel named it the Frank Ramirez Foundation, and he worked tirelessly to raise additional funds, speaking at fundraisers and writing grant proposals, channeling his grief into something productive and enduring. The first year, the foundation provided full scholarships to 5 students, covering everything from tuition to books to living expenses, and Daniel made it a point to meet each recipient personally, to tell them about Frank and to explain that their education was being funded by a man who understood the transformative power of opportunity. At the scholarship ceremony, Daniel stood before the recipients and their families, and he spoke about his father with a clarity and composure that surprised even himself. He described Frank's life in concrete terms: the tiny apartment, the night shifts, the decades of solitude, and he explained that Frank had never asked for recognition or gratitude, had never sought to insert himself into Daniel's life, because he believed that true love was selfless and invisible. Daniel said that the greatest gift his father had given him was not the money, but the example, the model of a life lived in service of another, and he urged the scholarship recipients to remember this, to understand that their success would be built on the foundation of someone else's sacrifice, and that they had a responsibility to honor that sacrifice by living with integrity and compassion. The families in the audience wept openly, many of them recognizing their own struggles in Frank's story, and after the ceremony, several parents approached Daniel to thank him, to tell him that they too worked night shifts, that they too lived in small apartments and counted pennies, and that seeing their children receive these scholarships felt like a validation of their own invisible labor. Daniel embraced them, feeling the weight of their exhaustion and hope, and he understood that Frank's legacy was not just about one man's devotion to one son, but about the larger truth that love could transcend visibility, that sacrifice could create ripples that extended far beyond the original act, touching lives that would never know the name of the person who had made their success possible. Daniel also began visiting Frank's grave regularly, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to maintain the connection, to continue the conversation that had started too late. He brought flowers each time, different varieties depending on the season, and he would sit on the grass beside the headstone and talk to Frank as though he were present, telling him about the foundation, about the scholarship recipients, about the ways Daniel was trying to honor the sacrifice. He spoke about his patience, about the difficult cases and the small victories, and he asked Frank questions he knew would never be answered, questions about what Frank had dreamed of, what he had wanted for himself, whether he had ever regretted the choice to remain silent and invisible. Sometimes Daniel would bring his medical diploma, the one he had placed on the grave the first time he visited, and he would hold it in his hands, reading the words that certified his expertise and authority, and he would think about how this piece of paper represented not just his own effort, but Frank's, how every hour of study had been made possible by an hour of labor, how every patient he healed was in some sense healed by Frank's hands as well. The diploma had become a kind of relic, a physical manifestation of the invisible connection between father and son, and Daniel treated it with reverence, understanding that it was the closest thing he had to a shared object, a tangible link between two lives that had run parallel but never intersected. 5 years after Frank's death, Daniel stood once again at the cemetery, but this time he was not alone. Around him were the scholarship recipients from the Frank Ramirez Foundation, now numbering over 50 students, each one representing a life that had been changed by the same invisible generosity that had shaped Daniel's own. They had come to mark the anniversary of the foundation's establishment, and they stood in a loose circle around Frank's grave, holding candles that flickered in the evening breeze, their faces illuminated by the soft golden light. Daniel looked at them and saw the continuation of Frank's legacy, the way one man's sacrifice had created a cascade of opportunity that would ripple through generations, touching people Frank would never meet, solving problems he would never know existed. Daniel spoke to the group, his voice steady and clear, telling them once again about the janitor who had worked night shifts for 30 years, who had lived in a tiny apartment and worn the same uniform until the fabric went thin, who had never asked for recognition or thanks, but had given everything anyway. He told them that Frank's story was not about martyrdom or suffering, but about the quiet power of love, about the way devotion could reshape the world without fanfare or applause. He said that each of them carried a piece of Frank's legacy now, that they were the living proof that invisible labor mattered, that unseen sacrifice had consequences that extended far beyond the moment, and that the greatest gift they could give in return was to live with the same integrity and generosity that Frank had embodied. After the ceremony, as the students dispersed into the twilight, Daniel remained at the grave, kneeling in the grass as he had done countless times before. He placed his hand on the headstone, feeling the cool roughness of the granite beneath his palm, and he closed his eyes, trying once more to conjure the presence of the man he had never known, but who had shaped every moment of his life. He thought about the nights Frank had spent walking home through rain and cold, about the afternoons he had woken up in that narrow bed with nothing to look forward to but another shift, another night of invisible labor. And Daniel felt a swell of gratitude so profound, it threatened to overwhelm him. He whispered the words he had whispered so many times before, words that felt inadequate but were all he had. "Thank you, Dad." The cemetery was quiet now, the other visitors gone, the sun sinking below the horizon and painting the sky in shades of rose and amber. Daniel stood slowly, his knees stiff from kneeling, and he took one last look at the grave, at the simple stone marker that bore Frank's name and dates, and he understood that this place had become sacred, not because of what was buried beneath it, but because of what it represented, the convergence of two lives that had never touched but had been inextricably bound, the meeting point of sacrifice and gratitude, of absence and presence, of silence and recognition. Frank had lived his entire life in the margins, but here, in this quiet corner of the cemetery, he had become the center, the foundation upon which everything else was built. As Daniel walked back to his car, he thought about the future, about the students who would graduate with degrees funded by the foundation, about the careers they would build and the families they would support, and he understood that Frank's invisibility had been transformed into a kind of immortality, that the janitor who had scrubbed floors in silence was now a force that would echo through time, shaping lives he would never witness, solving problems he would never comprehend. Daniel had spent years trying to understand his father, trying to reconstruct a person from fragments and silences, but he realized now that Frank was not reducible to a single narrative or a coherent biography. He was instead a principle, a way of being in the world, a model of love that asked for nothing and gave everything, and this principle would endure long after the details of his life had faded from memory. Daniel started the car and drove through the city as night fell, the streetlights flickering on one by one, casting pools of illumination across the pavement. He thought about all the people working at this moment, the janitors and the cleaners, the nurses and the security guards, all the invisible laborers who kept the world turning while others slept, and he felt a kinship with them, a recognition that they were all part of the same story, the same ongoing narrative of sacrifice and devotion that had shaped human life since the beginning. Frank had been one among millions, but his story had been told, his name had been spoken, and this small act of recognition felt like a kind of justice, a correction to the world's tendency to overlook the people who mattered most. When Daniel arrived home, he went to the mantel where he kept the photograph of Frank holding him as an infant, and he stood before it in the darkness, not turning on the lights, letting his eyes adjust until he could see the contours of his father's face, the young man who had made a choice that would define the rest of his life. Daniel placed his hand over his heart, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his ribs, and he understood that this heartbeat was not his alone, but carried within it the echo of Frank's sacrifice, the invisible architecture of love that had given Daniel life and breath and purpose. He whispered into the darkness, not a prayer but a promise, a vow to honor the gift he had been given by living with the same quiet courage, the same selfless devotion, the same unwavering commitment to making the world better for others, even when no one was watching. And in that moment, standing alone in his apartment with only the photograph for company, Daniel felt his father's presence more clearly than he ever had before, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living force, a current that ran through him and connected him to something larger than himself. Frank Ramirez had been a janitor, a stranger, a man who had lived and died in obscurity, but he had also been a father, a hero, a beacon of invisible grace, and his legacy would endure not in monuments or public recognition, but in the quiet, transformative work of love that asked for nothing and changed everything. Daniel stood in the darkness, tears streaming down his face, and he understood that this was not the end of the story, but the beginning. That every day forward would be an opportunity to honor the sacrifice, to carry the legacy, to ensure that the man who had worked night shifts for 30 years would never truly be a stranger again. Daniel stood at the podium of the Grand Ballroom in downtown Austin, 15 years after he had first learned Frank's name, and looked out at an audience of over 1,000 people gathered for the annual Frank Ramirez Foundation Gala. The room glittered with chandeliers and formal attire, a stark contrast to the tiny apartment where his father had lived, and Daniel felt the weight of this contradiction pressing against his chest like a stone. He had built something enormous from the fragments of Frank's invisible life, transforming his father's solitude into a movement that now provided scholarships to over 300 students each year. But there were moments like this when the grandeur felt wrong, when Daniel wondered if Frank would have wanted his name spoken in ballrooms and celebrated by people who wore jewelry worth more than he had earned in a lifetime. Yet Daniel also understood that this was how change happened, that making the invisible visible required spectacle and attention, that honoring Frank's sacrifice meant ensuring that others like him would not have to choose between their own survival and their children's futures. The speeches that night were moving and eloquent, scholarship recipients sharing stories of transformation that echoed Daniel's own, parents weeping as they described the relief of knowing their children's educations were secure, community leaders praising the foundation's work and calling for similar initiatives across the country. Daniel listened to each speaker with genuine attention, recognizing in their words the same themes that had defined his relationship with Frank: sacrifice, invisibility, the quiet heroism of working-class life, the transformative power of opportunity. When it was his turn to speak, he did not use notes, having long ago memorized the essential truths of his father's story, and he told the audience about the janitor who had worked night shifts for 30 years, speaking slowly and deliberately, allowing each detail to settle into the silence before moving to the next. He described the tiny apartment, the worn uniforms, the photograph on the wall, and he watched as people in the audience reached for tissues, their faces contorted with emotion, and he understood that Frank's story had become a kind of parable, a narrative that people used to make sense of their own struggles and sacrifices. After the gala, Daniel drove to the cemetery alone, still wearing his tuxedo, the bow tie loosened around his neck. It was past midnight, the city quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren, and when he arrived at Frank's grave, he found it exactly as he had left it earlier that week, the flowers he had brought still fresh, their petals holding the last traces of color in the moonlight. Daniel sat on the grass, not caring that the damp earth would stain his expensive clothes, and he looked at the headstone that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. He told Frank about the gala, about the money they had raised, about the new students who would receive scholarships in the fall, and he apologized for the spectacle, for the way his father's life had been turned into something public and performative when Frank himself had lived with such deliberate privacy. Daniel said he hoped Frank understood that this was the only way he knew how to honor the sacrifice, that making noise on behalf of the silent was the closest he could come to justice. The foundation had expanded beyond scholarships in recent years, branching into advocacy work and policy reform, lobbying for better wages and working conditions for janitorial staff and other low-wage workers. Daniel had hired a team of organizers and lawyers, people who understood the systemic forces that kept workers like Frank trapped in cycles of poverty and invisibility, and together they had won small but significant victories: a living wage ordinance in Austin, improved overtime protections, union recognition at several major cleaning companies. Each victory felt like a tribute to Frank, a way of ensuring that the next generation of parents would not have to sacrifice as completely as he had, and Daniel threw himself into this work with the same intensity he had once reserved for medicine, understanding that healing society required the same diagnostic precision and persistent care as healing individual bodies. Daniel had also written a book about Frank, a memoir that combined personal narrative with social analysis, exploring the ways invisible labor sustained modern life and the moral obligations that arose from this dependence. The book had been unexpectedly successful, spending several weeks on bestseller lists and generating thousands of letters from readers who recognized their own experiences in Frank's story. Publishers had wanted to sensationalize it, to emphasize the dramatic revelation and the emotional reunion that never happened. But Daniel had resisted, insisting on a quieter, more contemplative approach that honored the texture of Frank's actual life rather than transforming it into melodrama. The book had become required reading in several medical schools and social work programs, used as a case study in empathy and systemic thinking, and Daniel received regular invitations to speak at universities and conferences, opportunities he accepted when his schedule allowed, always careful to center Frank's experience rather than his own. His personal life had changed too, shaped by the lessons he had learned from Frank's sacrifice. Daniel had married a woman named Sophia, a social worker who specialized in housing advocacy, and together they had 2 children, a daughter named Elena and a son named Francisco, the Spanish version of Frank's name. Daniel had been terrified of fatherhood at first, haunted by the fear that he would somehow replicate Frank's absence or fail to provide the presence his own children deserved. But Sophia had helped him understand that awareness of the pattern was itself a form of breaking it. That knowing what he had missed allowed him to give what his children needed. He coached Elena's soccer team, attended Francisco's school plays, read bedtime stories every night he was not on call at the hospital. And in these small rituals of presence, he found a way to honor Frank by being the father Frank had never been allowed to be. On Francisco's 10th birthday, Daniel took him to the cemetery for the first time, explaining gently who was buried there and why this person mattered. Francisco had listened with the solemn attention children reserve for important truths. And when Daniel finished, the boy had asked if he could leave something at the grave. Daniel said yes, and Francisco had placed a drawing he had made at school. A crayon portrait of a man in a blue uniform holding a mop with the words, "Thank you, Great-Grandpa Frank," written in wobbly letters across the top. Daniel had wept openly, not caring that his son saw him cry, understanding that this was another way of teaching, another form of presence, showing Francisco that men could feel deeply and express emotion without shame. They had sat together at the grave for nearly an hour, Daniel telling stories about Frank that he had assembled from fragments and research, creating a narrative that was part fact and part mythology, a grandfather for his son to know, even though they would never meet. The medical practice Daniel maintained had become increasingly focused on underserved populations, and he spent 2 days each week at free clinics in the neighborhoods where people like Frank had lived and worked. He treated janitors and housekeepers, delivery drivers and warehouse workers, people whose bodies bore the evidence of hard labor and inadequate health care, and in each patient he saw echoes of his father, the way chronic pain and exhaustion had been normalized. The way medical care was a luxury they could not afford until conditions became desperate. Daniel advocated fiercely for his patients, fighting with insurance companies and hospital administrators, using his credentials and status to demand the kind of care these patients deserved but rarely received. And he understood that this too was a form of honoring Frank, using the opportunities Frank's sacrifice had created to serve the community Frank had belonged to. There were difficult moments, times when the weight of Frank's absence felt unbearable, when Daniel was overwhelmed by the impossibility of ever fully repaying the debt he owed. He had sought therapy to process the complex grief, working with a counselor who specialized in ambiguous loss and intergenerational trauma, and through this work, he had learned to hold both gratitude and sorrow simultaneously, to accept that some wounds could not be healed, but only tended, that living with unresolved grief was not a failure, but a testament to the depth of love. The therapist had helped him understand that Frank's choice to remain invisible had been both gift and wound, that the same act that had freed Daniel to pursue his dreams had also deprived him of relationship, and that both truths could coexist without contradiction. Daniel had also reconnected with the community of night shift workers, attending their union meetings and social gatherings, learning their names and stories, understanding that his connection to Frank was not unique, but part of a larger web of relationships between the visible and invisible sectors of society. He had funded a community center in the neighborhood where Frank's apartment had been, a space where night shift workers could gather during their off hours, access resources, participate in workshops, and build solidarity with one another. The center bore Frank's name, and on its walls were photographs of other workers who had lived and died in obscurity, a collective memorial that insisted these lives mattered, that their labor had value, that their sacrifices deserved recognition and remembrance. On the 20th anniversary of Frank's death, Daniel organized a citywide day of recognition for essential workers, coordinating with local government and media outlets to ensure maximum visibility. Throughout Austin, buildings displayed banners thanking janitors and cleaners, news stations ran features about the lives of night shift workers, and the mayor issued a proclamation declaring it Frank Ramirez Day, a permanent annual observance dedicated to recognizing invisible labor. Daniel had pushed for this with the same persistence Frank had brought to his work, refusing to accept no for an answer, leveraging every connection and resource at his disposal. And when the day finally arrived, he felt a sense of completion, as though he had managed to turn the city's attention toward the people it usually ignored, forcing a moment of collective recognition that might shift consciousness, even incrementally. That evening, Daniel returned to the cemetery with his entire family, Sophia, Elena, Francisco, and his adoptive parents, who were now elderly but still vibrant and engaged. They stood together at Frank's grave as the sun set, casting long shadows across the headstones, and they took turns sharing what Frank's legacy had meant to them. Elena, now a teenager interested in social justice, spoke about how learning Frank's story had shaped her understanding of inequality and inspired her activism. Francisco talked about the pride he felt in carrying Frank's name, the way it connected him to a history of sacrifice and resilience. Sophia described how Frank's example had influenced her own work, reminding her that every client she served had a story of struggle that deserved respect and attention. Daniel's adoptive parents spoke about the privilege of having known Frank, even briefly, and the way his quiet dignity had moved them to reflect on their own lives and choices. When it was Daniel's turn, he found himself unable to speak at first, the emotions too large for language, but eventually he managed to say that Frank had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that love was not measured by proximity or recognition, but by what you were willing to give up, by how completely you could devote yourself to another person's flourishing, even at the cost of your own. He said that every day since learning Frank's identity had been an exercise in trying to live up to that standard, in trying to be worthy of the sacrifice, and that he would spend the rest of his life working to ensure that no other child would have to grow up not knowing the parent who loved them most. He said that Frank had been a stranger in name only, that his presence had been woven into every moment of Daniel's life, every decision and every achievement, and that this invisible presence was more real and more powerful than any physical relationship could have been. As darkness fell and the family prepared to leave, Daniel asked for a moment alone. They walked back to the cars, giving him space, and he knelt once more at the grave, placing his hand on the stone as he had done thousands of times before. He thought about the young man in the photograph, holding an infant with such tenderness and hope, and he tried to imagine what Frank had felt in that moment, the simultaneous love and grief, the knowledge that he was giving away the thing he wanted most in order to give his son the future he deserved. Daniel understood now, in a way he had not been able to 20 years earlier, that Frank's choice had not been about absence, but about a different kind of presence, a love so vast it could survive invisibility, so strong it could bridge the gap between two lives that never touched but were never truly separate. Daniel pulled from his pocket a folded piece of paper, a letter he had written to Frank, knowing it would never be read, but needing to write it anyway. In it, he had tried to explain everything: the foundation, the advocacy work, the family he had built, the ways he had tried to honor the sacrifice. But as he held it in his hands, he realized that all of this information was secondary to the essential truth he needed Frank to know. He unfolded the letter and read aloud the final paragraph, his voice steady and clear in the quiet of the cemetery. "You were never a stranger to me, even after I learned your name. You have been with me every moment of my life, in every choice I made, in every person I helped, in every lesson I taught my children. You gave me everything, asking for nothing, and I have spent these years trying to understand what that means, trying to live in a way that honors your sacrifice. I do not know if I have succeeded, but I know that I have tried, and I know that your love, invisible though it was, has been the foundation of everything good in my life. Thank you, Dad. Thank you for seeing me when I could not see you. Thank you for loving me from the shadows. Thank you for being the father I needed, even though you could never be the father I knew. He folded the letter carefully and placed it at the base of the headstone, weighing it down with a small stone so the wind would not carry it away. He stood slowly, his knees protesting after so long kneeling, and he took one last look at the grave, at the simple marker that had become the axis around which his adult life had revolved. The cemetery was almost completely dark now, the only light coming from a distant street lamp and the faint glow of the city on the horizon. And in this darkness, Daniel felt a strange peace, a sense that he had finally said what needed to be said, that the distance between himself and Frank had been bridged not by proximity, but by understanding, by the slow accumulation of years spent learning to see the world as Frank had seen it. As Daniel walked back to his car, he thought about the future, about the students who would continue to receive scholarships long after he was gone, about the policies that would protect workers from exploitation, about the stories that would be told and retold, keeping Frank's memory alive in the collective consciousness. He understood that this work would never be finished, that the struggle for recognition and justice was ongoing and would require the efforts of many people across many generations. But he also understood that Frank had given him the blueprint, had shown him through his own life what it meant to work toward a goal you would never see completed, to sacrifice for a future you would never inhabit. This was the final lesson, Daniel realized, that love was not just an emotion but a practice, not just a feeling but a commitment, and that the measure of a life was not what you accomplished for yourself, but what you made possible for others. Daniel started the car and pulled out of the cemetery parking lot, joining the flow of traffic on the main road. And as he drove home through the city his father had cleaned and cared for, he felt Frank's presence beside him, not as a ghost, but as a guide, a quiet voice that would accompany him through every challenge and every triumph for the rest of his life. The janitor, who had worked night shifts for 30 years, had died alone in a tiny apartment, but his legacy had spread like light through water, touching thousands of lives, reshaping institutions, altering the way people thought about work and sacrifice and love. Frank Ramirez had been invisible in life, but in death he had become eternal, his story a reminder that the most profound acts of love are often the ones no one sees, that true heroism requires no audience, and that the greatest gift one person can give another is the freedom to become who they were meant to be, even if it means remaining forever in the background, forever a stranger, forever unknown, but never unloved.